Great. Hi, guys. Today we will be exploring the Ciutadella and the Eixample. And then looking at our agenda, first we will be going through the image of both of these areas, as well as the historical origins and key architectural styles and monuments. And then we will wrap it up with the Parc de la Ciutadella and the 1888 Universal Exhibition. So starting off, one district that really embodies the elegance, creativity, and modern spirit of Barcelona that we have all probably been to 100 times is the Eixample. Today, the Eixample represents what many scholars describe as the cosmopolitan image of the city, evolving into one of Barcelona's most important commercial and recreational districts. Along avenues like Passeig de Gràcia, luxury brands such as Chanel and Dior sit alongside Gaudi's architectural masterpieces, creating not only a space of high-end luxury shopping, but also an architectural showcase. Some of Barcelona's most famous landmarks in here, including Sagrada Familia, Casa Batlló, Casa Milà, among many others, all of which attract millions of visitors every year. And while the Eixample represents the commercial and architectural side of modern Barcelona, nearby the Parc de la Ciutadella represents the city's public and social life. The park is one of Barcelona's most important green spaces and acts as a major gathering space for residents and visitors alike. People come here for picnics, concerts, street performances, and it contains important institutions such as the Parliament of Catalonia, the fountain, which we've all been to, and the zoo, of course. And because of its central location between the historic center and the Eixample expansion, the park serves as an important social and cultural meeting point where locals, students, and tourists interact. In recent years, as we all know, thanks to the Barcelona model and ushered on by the 1992 Olympic Games, tourism has surged tremendously in both of these areas, from about 1.7 million visitors in 1990 to over 12 million in 2019. And as a result, many apartments have been converted into short-term rentals and boutique hotels. Today, the districts of Ciutadella, Eixample, and Gràcia account for more than 70% of tourist accommodations in Barcelona, and nearly 40% of beds in the Eixample are for tourists. These changes have contributed to rising housing prices and shifts in the social composition of the neighborhood. And even though Cerdà's original plan envisioned open courtyards and green spaces, the district today is much denser with congestion, pollution, and overcrowding. And in response to these challenges, Barcelona has begun experimenting with a new urban planning strategy known as super blocks or superiors. A super block reorganizes several city blocks into a larger unit where through traffic is redirected and streets are redesigned to be more pedestrian friendly. In the Eixample, streets such as Conseil de Cent were transformed in 2023 into green corridors with trees, bike lanes, benches, and areas for public gathering. These projects aim to reduce traffic, improve air quality, and create more livable public spaces for residents. In many ways, these initiatives attempt to return to Cerdà's original vision, which Addi will dive deeper into right now.
Great. Now that Ellie has discussed these neighborhoods' current state and recent transformation, I'll address their origin. Prior to the Eixample's origination, Barcelona was confined within medieval walls, which became a major problem. Barcelona had industrialized very quickly, and the population was very dense, with over 800 inhabitants per hectare inside a small area. Living conditions were poor, hygiene was limited, and mortality rates were very high. And life expectancy was only about 36 years for the wealthy and just 23 years for the working class. Because of these conditions, many in Barcelona viewed the city walls as a barrier to progress. And as we discussed in class, Mark Miller describes the fortifications as a noose that strangled expansion and contributed to disease, and also prevented Barcelona from realizing its full potential. So after political unrest and a cholera outbreak in the 1850s, pressure to remove the walls began to increase across all social classes. And finally, in 1854, the demolition of the wall began. This expansion became the Eixample, which means extension in Catalan, and this area was designed by the Catalan engineer Ildefons Cerdà, who believed in utopianism and whose plan was approved eventually by the central government in Madrid in 1859, and his plan was picked over Antoni Rovira y Trias. Overall, Cerdà looked to urbanize the rural and ruralize the urban, and he focused on three main things: hygiene, circulation, and equality. He wanted a city that improved health and quality of life through wide streets, natural ventilation, and open space, and so organized a grid of square blocks, each about 113 meters across, and then each had 45-degree angles called chamfra to improve visibility and traffic flow at intersections. In addition, each street was designed to be about 20 to 30 meters wide to act as what Serda described as an aerial channel. And so, like a lung that allowed air and light to circulate all throughout the city. And so, while he originally envisioned a socially mixed city with open courtyards and green space, a lot of these ideals, as Ali mentioned, were gradually undermined by real estate and other pressures. And in addition, there was a big rise of bourgeoisie with increasing wealthy merchants and professionals moving out of the crowded medieval center into the Eixample. Another important transformation happened nearby at the Parc de la Ciutadella, which was originally a site of military fortress built in the 18th century after the Bourbon victory in the War of Spanish Succession. The citadel overall was meant to control the city, and nearly 1,000 houses were demolished to build it. And so it became a symbol of repression. And so a lot of people within Barcelona wanted it removed. And finally, in 1869, the fortress was demolished, which Aradhya will go into in a bit. Altogether, these developments within the Eixample and Ciutadella marked very significant changes within Barcelona and also created a setting where modernism could take place, which Isabel will now get into.
Thank you, Addi. Now that Addi has walked through the historical origins of the Eixample with the demolition of the wall, Serta's grid, and the transformation of the citadel, I want to now turn to what filled that very grid, which was the architectural movement that made Barcelona famous worldwide, which is called modernism. So, modernism is the Catalan variant of the French Art Nouveau, emerging at the end of the 19th century, but it was more than merely just a decorative style. It combined industrial pieces through red brick and wrought iron with traditional, so colorful tiles, ceramics, and stained glass, while also pulling from Gothic and Moorish traditions. It brought together old and new construction techniques at the same time. That mix was completely intentional. As architect David McKay explains, it came to be identified with the overall movement of Catalan national affirmation, distinct from Spanish identity and more in line with broader European cultural trends. It was a way of saying, we are modern, but we also have our own unique history. The Eixample had given the city a rational modern grid, but modernism gave it its character. The combination was deliberate. The ordered geometry of Cerda's blocks, paired with the organic medieval forms of modernist buildings, embodied the dual ambition of Catalan nationalism to modernize and Europeanize Catalonia, while simultaneously recovering its medieval past and asserting its own cultural independence. The bourgeoisie, as previously mentioned, were central to this. The wealthy industrialists and merchants who had moved into the Eixample in the wake of Catalonia's industrial boom became the patrons of modernism. They commissioned the most prominent architects to build private residences that also stood as public statements of cultural pride. As Josep Miguel Sobrera posits, the collaboration between architects and the bourgeoisie was symbiotic. The buildings ennobled their owners while expressing the broader aspirations of a reviving Catalan nation. Now moving to the block of discord. The most concentrated expression of this movement appears on a single block of Passeig de Gracia, known as the block of discord, or in Spanish, La Manzana de la Discordia. Between 1898 and 1906, three of the greatest modernist architects each redesigned a building on the same block, in three completely different interpretations of the style. First, Casa Yeo Morera by Luis Dominic y Montaner was built for the Morera industrialist family. Its interior is a display of Art Nouveau opulence, brightly colored floral patterns, stained glass, and decorative sculpture. It is now occupied by the luxury firm Loewe. Next door, Casa Amatier by Josep Puig y Cadafalch was built for chocolatier Antoni Amatier. Puig looked back to the Catalan Gothic architecture and even introduced Germanic overtones in the castellated roofline, making it look, in Tobin's words, as we read in class, like something out of a picture book. And then lastly, there is Casa Batlló by Antoni Gaudí, which is the most famous on the block. It was built for textural textile manufacturer Josep Batlló and Gaudi covered the facade in broken tile called trencadís in shimmering blues and greens that evoke the Mediterranean. The sinuous roofline, pierced by a lance-like structure, is widely interpreted as the legendary dragon of St. George, which is the patron saint of Catalonia. These three buildings reflect the three pillars of the movement. First, we have Gaudi, who was the most famous and experimental in his works, pushing organic form to its extreme. Then we had Dominic, who was the most prolific, leaving his mark across the Eixample with the Palau de la Música and the Hospital de Sant Pau. And lastly, Puig was the most political, deeply involved in Catalan nationalist politics, so much so that his architecture was as much a manifesto as a building. Together, these three turn the Eixample into what McDonough calls a rich world patrimony, where the grid Serta built became the canvas on which Catalonia wrote its cultural identity. I'll now hand it over to Arod.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Isabel. Now we're going to speak on the Ciutadella as well as the 1888 Universal Exhibition. And so I want to start with something that Addi spoke about, which after the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, the Bourbon monarchy built a very large military fortress in Barcelona to control the city as well as Catalonia. And so, what makes the demolition of this space and this exhibition so interesting is that Barcelona uses such a space to present itself to the world, right? They're intentionally transforming this fortress of oppression into a stage for modernity. Now, this exhibition's purpose was to showcase Barcelona's industry, culture, as well as architecture to an international audience. Cities like Paris and London, which are major global cities even at this time, had already had similar world fairs, and so Barcelona wanted to demonstrate that it too belonged amongst Europe's very modern and cosmopolitan cities. And so now, using this exhibition, they could introduce themselves to the world. And so now we're going to move on to the Arc de Triomphe, which is one of the keynotes of this exhibition. Visitors would enter the exhibition through the Arc de Triomphe, which we've all seen a million times. And this arc served as a ceremonial gateway into the fair. What's different about Barcelona is that unlike other arches that celebrate military victories like the famous one in Paris, Barcelona's arch really symbolized progress, commerce, as well as cultural achievement, which was the purpose of the fair. Another really cool aspect is that the arch was decorated with sculpted friezes that represent Barcelona welcoming all of these foreign nations. Again, kind of reinforcing that idea that Barcelona is really open, it's an international space. Architecturally, this connects to modernism, right? As Isabel just discussed, one of the key architects involved with the exhibition was Dominique Montanet, and his whole goal was to experiment with a lot of new decorative styles like the friezes, while also expressing and reviving a very distinct Catalan cultural identity through architecture. And today, this Arc de Triomphe still functions kind of like a gateway between the Eixample and the Parc de la Ciutadella, linking that 19th century expansion of Barcelona along with the modern city that we see today. Finally, moving into the last bit here, this exhibition was really amazing for Barcelona, but also really highlighted a lot of important contradictions in the city at the time. At one end, Barcelona is presenting itself as this modern, unified, culturally vibrant city with industrial progress, but at the same time, rapid industrialization created a lot of deep social inequality and poverty-related issues. Barcelona became a center for labor movements and anarchist activity, and tensions between workers, political groups, as well as the state itself continued to grow. People even interpret Gaudi's Sagrada Familia as kind of a symbolic response to those tensions. But all in all, these conflicts would eventually erupt into events like the tragic week of 1909, which we discussed at length last week in class. So while Barcelona was building parks, monuments, exhibitions to project this modern image onto the world, the city was also experiencing some underlying intense political and social conflict. But yeah, just want to round it out with connecting all of our points. Overall, the neighborhood that we've examined reflects how Barcelona's identity has been shaped through the relationship between history, architecture, urban space. Addi showed us that the city's historical development with the medieval city and the Bourbon Citadel shaped Barcelona's physical layout. Then Isabel laid out how the rise of modernism allowed Catalan artists and architects to express cultural identity. And then building on that, the Universal Exhibition transformed that former citadel into a public space that showed Barcelona's modern identity into the world, while Ellie discussed that looking at the city today, these spaces continue to shape Barcelona's image as a really global and highly visited city. And so together, these examples show how Barcelona's built environment reflects political change, cultural identity, as well as the way that the city presents itself to the world. Thank you.